Good afternoon, Chuck Morse. Thanks for joining me. You know, it's become very fashionable and very common for liberals to accuse conservatives who are supportive of building a wall along various parts of our national border, which, by the way, is probably, as imperfect as it is, the best way of controlling illegal immigration. To claim that their motivation is racist. They've got something against the immigrants because they are people of color, allegedly. I mean, not that necessarily Latin Americans are people of color. That's a debate. But, this charge is a very serious one, and it's one that ought to be addressed. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about this. The fact of the matter is that the main concern with regard to mass immigration of any one particular group is not race. It has more to do with culture. It has more to do with language. It's much more complex than that. It has to do with the economy of the country. It has to do with the well-being of the country in general. Yes, I suppose race is a part of it. But I think that it's safe to say that these complexities are of concern to all Americans, to liberals and conservatives, to Democrats and Republicans, to white people and to people of color. I mean, all Americans are concerned with the potential impact of a mass immigration, a mass migration of any foreign ethnic group, and ought to be. Now, the left likes to point to the fact that historically, Americans were concerned in the 1840s with the immigration of the Irish, maybe at the turn of the century with the immigration of Italians and Jews and French Canadians and Poles and other groups. And that they claimed that that was racist, even though putting aside the fact that these people happen to be white, but that's beside the point. And we know with 2020 hindsight, historically, that those mass immigrations proved to work out superbly for this country. My grandparents were part of that. But the fact of the matter is that at the time, that was not necessarily assumed. And the problem was not race. The problem was questions, I think, primarily among Americans, even though race obviously had part of it, that the new immigrants would not be able to assimilate, would not be able to embrace American culture, American ideas, American principles, our constitutional way of life, our system of competition, our system of freedom. They wouldn't thrive in the American atmosphere, and instead they might try to change us to be more like the authoritarian systems that they had fled. And the fact is that that didn't happen, but we only know that because of history. Now, today's question, of course, is, are certain immigrant groups also, will they be able to assimilate? Will they embrace American principles? I mean, George Washington, in his farewell address, addressed this question by pointing out that while many Americans, and I'm paraphrasing here, come from different manners, as he called it, different orientations, different religions, his hope was that while he understood that people wanted to preserve their religions and their cultures, and said so, for example, to the Jewish community of Providence, Rhode Island, in a proclamation to the Torah synagogue that is very proudly displayed on the grounds of that synagogue to this day. He also expressed the hope and the opinion that all of the ethnic groups in this country and religions would put America first. They would put their loyalty to the country first, and they would put their striving toward becoming American and embracing our culture and our ways as their first and foremost consideration. And the fact is that they did just do just that. But that doesn't mean that necessarily a mass immigration today from any particular group will do the same. We don't know that. And so I think that all Americans are concerned about that. Would a mass immigration from Somalia or Sudan or Yemen or Syria necessarily embrace American ways? Could they integrate their Islamic faith with the American ethos of limited government and free religion and capitalism and the free market and one that tolerates differences? We don't know that. And so far, the record in Europe apparently is not very good in terms of indicating that that would be the case. With regard to Central America and Latin America, I don't think the issue is race. I don't think the issue is even culture, because culturally, I think that Latin Americans are very similar to us. You know, they're Christians. They're generally conservative people. The question there is more economic. The question is whether or not our economy can absorb and our labor force can absorb mass numbers of working people and still thrive. And the answer to that question is not necessarily known. I mean, it's something that the economists need to talk about. But really the issue of resentment comes up more in that rather than the older system, the system that my grandparents observed, where new immigrants would have to have what was called a charge. They would have to have a sponsor. They would have to agree that they would not become burdens of the state, that the economy could absorb them, that they could be gainfully employed. Now you have a phenomenon where people who are immigrating into this country who are not of means get welfare. And I think that working Americans, working taxpayers resent that. And they don't like the fact that people are literally being paid not to work until they can work. And there are questions about whether or not ultimately they intend to work. So I would argue that ultimately the question with regard to Latin American immigration is more of an economic question than it is a cultural or racial question. But ultimately, I'd point out that like any sane sovereign nation in the world, the United States has the right to decide who enters into the national home for any reason. We don't have to explain why we would not have any group of people, or to the degree that we would have them. We have a right to do it based on self-interest. You know, we want to offer political asylum to people whose lives are threatened, but at the same time, we want to maintain standards for that. For example, the blind sheikh who bombed the World Trade Center, he was a political asylumee. You know, what are they fleeing from, and are they legitimate? We want to make sure they're screened properly. We want to make sure they are vetted properly. And then, yes, we want to welcome them. With regard to refugees, again, we want to welcome them based upon ultimately our own national interests first. Like, for example, we welcomed in probably hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese boat people because we felt an obligation to do so. They were fleeing for their lives, and they have turned out to be one of the very best immigrant groups we've ever had. I mean, they're industrious, they are, self-sufficient, they're successful, and they've assimilated very well. Same thing with the Haitians. So it depends on a lot of very complex factors. And suffice it to say that it is not appropriate, and it's pure demagoguery to boil the thing down like the left likes to do as a means to attack anybody who doesn't agree with them, while at the same time they probably, and in fact they do, harbor some of the same general concerns and tendencies that everyone else has. This is a way for them to feel more virtuous while attacking their enemies and by pretending that they believe something else. The fact is that these are very profound and very serious questions that ought to be addressed soberly and without this kind of invective and attack. So anyway, those are my thoughts on that issue. Thanks for watching, everybody.